Imagine waking up one morning to discover that your country no longer exists as you knew it. Neighbors become enemies. Brothers march into battle against brothers. Families are torn apart by politics, loyalty, and the brutal reality of war. Smoke rises over towns, cannons thunder across open fields, and an entire nation is consumed by bloodshed. Between 1861 and 1865, the United States fought the deadliest war in its history. More than 620,000 soldiers, and possibly as many as 750,000 according to modern estimates, lost their lives. Millions more saw their homes destroyed, their livelihoods shattered, and their futures forever altered. The American Civil War was not simply a struggle between North and South. It was a conflict over the very meaning of freedom, democracy, and the future of the United States. By the time the war ended, the nation had been transformed in ways that still shape America today. This is the story of the American Civil War, a nation divided. When the United States gained independence from Britain in 1776, it was a young nation filled with hope and opportunity. But beneath its promises of liberty lay a contradiction that would grow more dangerous with each passing decade. Millions of African Americans remained enslaved, particularly in the southern states. Their forced labor fueled vast plantations producing cotton, tobacco, rice, and sugar. Cotton became one of America's most valuable exports, earning the South the nickname King Cotton. The northern states developed along a different path. Rapid industrialization led to factories, railroads, banks, and expanding cities. Immigrants from Europe poured into northern communities, providing labor for growing industries and contributing to a more diversified economy. As these two regions evolved, their interests increasingly clashed. The South depended heavily on enslaved labor and sought to protect it. Many in the North opposed the expansion of slavery into new territories, though opinions ranged from moderate opposition to calls for immediate abolition. Every new territory joining the Union raised the same explosive question: would it allow slavery, or would it be free? Each answer shifted the balance of political power in Congress, making every decision a national crisis. Growing political tension. Throughout the first half of the 19th century, American leaders tried repeatedly to preserve peace through compromise. The Missouri Compromise of 1820 attempted to maintain a balance between free and slave states. Later, the Compromise of 1850 sought to ease growing tensions by admitting California as a free state, while strengthening laws requiring the return of escaped enslaved people. Yet these measures only delayed the inevitable. In 1854, the Kansas-Nebraska Act allowed settlers in new territories to decide the issue of slavery for themselves through popular vote. Instead of resolving the conflict, it sparked violence. Supporters and opponents of slavery flooded into Kansas, determined to influence the outcome. Armed clashes, murders, and political chaos earned the territory the grim nickname Bleeding Kansas. The nation watched in horror as Americans killed fellow Americans over the future of slavery. Even Congress was not immune. In 1856, Senator Charles Sumner of Massachusetts delivered a fiery speech condemning slavery. Days later, Representative Preston Brooks of South Carolina attacked Sumner with a heavy cane on the Senate floor, beating him so severely that he required years to recover. The assault shocked many Northerners while some Southerners celebrated Brooks as a hero. Compromise was becoming impossible. The rise of Abraham Lincoln. During these turbulent years, a lawyer from Illinois began attracting national attention. His name was Abraham Lincoln. Lincoln believed slavery was morally wrong and opposed its expansion into new territories. Although he initially focused on preventing its spread rather than abolishing it everywhere at once, many Southern leaders viewed his ideas as an existential threat. Lincoln's debates with Senator Stephen Douglas in 1858 made him one of the country's most recognizable political figures. In one memorable speech, Lincoln warned, "A house divided against itself cannot stand." He believed the United States could not remain permanently divided between free and slave states. Those words resonated deeply across the North, but intensified fears across the South. The election of 1860. The presidential election of 1860 became one of the most consequential in American history. The Democratic Party split into Northern and Southern factions, weakening its chances. Lincoln, representing the newly formed Republican Party, won the presidency despite receiving very little support in the Deep South. To many Southern leaders, Lincoln's victory signaled that they had lost political influence within the federal government. Even before he took office, South Carolina declared its secession from the Union on December 20, 1860. Within weeks, Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, and Texas followed. These states claimed they were exercising their constitutional right to leave the Union and protect their institutions, including slavery. In February 1861, they formed a new nation, the Confederate States of America. They elected Jefferson Davis as their president and established their capital first in Montgomery, Alabama, before later moving it to Richmond, Virginia. The United States was now divided into two rival governments, each claiming legitimacy. War had not yet begun, but the countdown had. A nation on the edge. As Abraham Lincoln prepared to take office in March 1861, desperate efforts were made to prevent armed conflict. Politicians proposed new compromises. Religious leaders prayed for peace. Ordinary citizens hoped that reason would prevail. Lincoln insisted that while he would not initiate aggression, he also would not recognize the Confederacy as an independent nation. Meanwhile, Confederate forces demanded that all federal forts within Southern territory be surrendered. One isolated fortress would soon become the center of a confrontation that neither side could avoid. Its name was Fort Sumter. The fate of the United States, and the future of millions, was about to be decided by the roar of cannon fired on the morning of April 12, 1861. The silence over Charleston Harbor, South Carolina, was shattered by the thunder of artillery. Confederate forces opened fire on Fort Sumter, a Union fort that had refused to surrender. For 34 hours, shells rained down on the isolated garrison. Surrounded and running low on supplies, Major Robert Anderson finally surrendered the fort on April 13th. Although no soldiers were killed during the bombardment itself, the attack marked the official beginning of the American Civil War. News spread rapidly across the nation. President Abraham Lincoln responded by calling for 75,000 volunteers to suppress the rebellion. His announcement forced several undecided Southern states, including Virginia, Arkansas, North Carolina, and Tennessee, to join the Confederacy. What had begun as a political crisis had become a full-scale war. Both sides prepare for battle. The Union, or the North, possessed significant advantages. It had a larger population, more factories, an extensive railroad network, and a stronger navy. These resources allowed it to manufacture weapons, transport troops, and maintain supplies more effectively. The Confederacy, however, had advantages of its own. Many of its military officers had served in the United States Army before the war and were highly experienced. They also fought largely on familiar territory and believed they were defending their homes and way of life. Each side expected a quick victory. They were both wrong. The conflict would last 4 long years and become one of the bloodiest wars in modern history. The Battle of Bull Run. The first major battle took place near Manassas, Virginia, in July 1861. Thousands of civilians from nearby Washington, D.C., traveled to watch the fighting, believing the battle would end the war. Instead, they witnessed chaos. Union forces initially pushed Confederate troops back, but Southern reinforcements arrived under General Thomas Jackson. His determined stand earned him the nickname Stonewall Jackson. The Union Army eventually retreated in confusion toward Washington. The defeat shocked the North. Both governments realized the war would not be won in a single battle. New leaders emerged. As the conflict intensified, remarkable military leaders rose to prominence. For the Confederacy, General Robert E. Lee became the South's greatest commander. Calm under pressure and respected by his soldiers, Lee won a series of impressive victories despite commanding smaller armies. Alongside him served the brilliant and fearless Stonewall Jackson, whose rapid movements often surprised Union forces. The Union struggled to find successful generals during the early years of the war. Eventually, determined leaders such as Ulysses S. Grant and William Tecumseh Sherman would emerge and change the course of the conflict. The Battle of Antietam. By 1862, General Lee invaded the North, hoping to secure a decisive victory on Union soil. His army met Union forces near Antietam Creek in Maryland on September 17, 1862. The fighting became the bloodiest single day in American military history. More than 22,000 soldiers were killed, wounded, or missing in just one day. Fields of corn turned into battlefields covered with smoke and bodies. Churches became hospitals. Streams ran red with blood. Although the battle ended without a clear tactical winner, Lee's invasion was stopped. For President Lincoln, that was enough. The Emancipation Proclamation. Following Antietam, Abraham Lincoln announced one of the most significant decisions of the war. On January 1, 1863, he issued the Emancipation Proclamation. The proclamation declared that enslaved people in Confederate-held territory were free. While it did not immediately free every enslaved person, it transformed the purpose of the war. The conflict was no longer fought solely to preserve the Union. It had also become a struggle against slavery. The proclamation discouraged European powers such as Britain and France from supporting the Confederacy, since openly backing a government defending slavery had become politically difficult. It also allowed thousands of African American men to join the Union Army. By the end of the war, nearly 180,000 black soldiers had served in Union forces, fighting courageously for freedom and equality. Gettysburg, the turning point. In the summer of 1863, General Lee launched another invasion of the North. His army entered Pennsylvania, where the two sides unexpectedly collided near the small town of Gettysburg on July 1st. For 3 days, fierce fighting raged across hills, farms, and rocky ridges. Union soldiers defended key positions such as Cemetery Hill and Little Round Top, repelling repeated Confederate attacks. On the final day, Lee made a bold gamble. Approximately 12,500 Confederate soldiers advanced across nearly a mile of open ground in what became known as Pickett's Charge. Union artillery and rifle fire devastated the advancing troops. The attack failed. Lee's army was forced to retreat back to Virginia. Gettysburg became the deadliest battle of the Civil War, with roughly 51,000 casualties. The Confederacy would never again launch a major invasion of the North. The tide of the war had begun to turn. Victory at Vicksburg. While Gettysburg captured headlines, another decisive victory unfolded farther west. General Ulysses S. Grant had spent months besieging the Confederate stronghold of Vicksburg, Mississippi. On July 4, 1863, just one day after Lee began retreating from Gettysburg, Vicksburg surrendered. The victory gave the Union complete control of the Mississippi River, splitting the Confederacy in two and cutting off vital supplies from the western states. It was one of the greatest strategic victories of the entire war. From that point forward, the Confederacy fought increasingly on the defensive. The Union now had momentum, stronger leadership, and growing confidence. But despite these victories, the fighting was far from over. The bloodiest chapters of the Civil War still lay ahead. By 1864, the American Civil War had entered its 4th year. What many had believed would be a short conflict had become a long and devastating struggle. Across the country, thousands of families mourned fallen sons, fathers, and brothers. Cities were scarred by war, farms lay abandoned, and entire communities struggled to survive. Despite enormous losses, neither side was willing to surrender. President Abraham Lincoln appointed General Ulysses S. Grant as commander of all Union armies. Unlike many previous Union generals, Grant refused to retreat after suffering heavy casualties. He understood that the Union's larger population and stronger industrial economy gave it the advantage in a prolonged war. Grant's strategy was simple but relentless. Keep constant pressure on Confederate forces until they could no longer fight. Grant versus Lee. Throughout 1864, Grant and Confederate General Robert E. Lee fought a series of brutal battles across Virginia. The Battle of the Wilderness, the Battle of Spotsylvania Court House, and the Battle of Cold Harbor became symbols of the war's terrible cost. Dense forests caught fire from artillery, trapping wounded soldiers. Trenches stretched across the landscape, foreshadowing the warfare of the 20th century. Both armies suffered staggering casualties. Yet every Confederate loss was harder to replace. The South had fewer soldiers, fewer factories, and fewer resources. While the Union could replenish its armies, the Confederacy grew weaker with each passing month. Grant continued pushing south toward Richmond, the Confederate capital, determined to end the war once and for all. Sherman's march to the sea. While Grant battled Lee in Virginia, Another Union general was changing the course of the war in the South. General William Tecumseh Sherman captured the city of Atlanta in September 1864, delivering a major blow to the Confederacy. The victory also strengthened Northern morale and helped secure President Lincoln's re-election later that year. After taking Atlanta, Sherman launched one of the most controversial campaigns in American history. Known as Sherman's March to the Sea, his army marched from Atlanta to Savannah, destroying railroads, bridges, factories, warehouses, and military supplies along the way. Sherman believed that breaking the Confederacy's ability and will to continue fighting would bring the war to a quicker end. As Union soldiers advanced, they tore up railroad tracks, burned cotton warehouses, seized livestock, and dismantled infrastructure that supported the Confederate war effort. For civilians, the march was devastating. Entire towns witnessed destruction on a scale they had never imagined. Although controversial, the campaign crippled the South's economy and weakened its capacity to continue the war. The fall of Richmond. By early 1865, the Confederate capital of Richmond, Virginia, stood on the brink of collapse. After months of fighting during the siege of Petersburg, Union forces finally broke through Confederate defenses. On April 2, 1865, General Lee evacuated Richmond. As Confederate officials fled, fires spread across parts of the city, destroying warehouses, businesses, and government buildings. The following day, Union troops entered Richmond. For many Americans, the fall of the Confederate capital signaled that the war was nearly over. The surrender at Appomattox. With his exhausted army surrounded and supplies nearly gone, General Robert E. Lee recognized that further resistance would only lead to unnecessary bloodshed. On April 9, 1865, Lee met General Ulysses S. Grant at the home of Wilmer McLean in the small village of Appomattox Court House, Virginia. The meeting was respectful and dignified. Grant offered generous surrender terms, allowing Confederate soldiers to return home after laying down their weapons. Officers were permitted to keep their sidearms, and many soldiers were allowed to take their horses home for spring planting. The Civil War was effectively over. After 4 years of unimaginable suffering, the guns finally fell silent. A nation mourns. The joy of victory was short-lived. Only 5 days after Lee's surrender, on the evening of April 14, 1865, President Abraham Lincoln attended a play at Ford's Theater in Washington, D.C. During the performance, actor and Confederate sympathizer John Wilkes Booth entered the presidential box and shot Lincoln in the back of the head. Lincoln died the following morning. The nation was plunged into grief. Millions mourned the leader who had guided the Union through its darkest years and witnessed the abolition of slavery. His assassination cast a shadow over the beginning of peace and left the difficult work of rebuilding the nation to others. Reconstruction and a new America. The end of the Civil War marked the beginning of Reconstruction, a challenging period of rebuilding the South and redefining the rights of millions of formerly enslaved people. In December 1865, the 13th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution officially abolished slavery throughout the United States. Later, the 14th Amendment granted citizenship and equal protection under the law, while the 15th Amendment sought to protect voting rights for African American men. Although these constitutional changes represented remarkable progress, Reconstruction faced fierce resistance, political conflict, and racial violence. The struggle for equality would continue for generations. The legacy of the Civil War. The American Civil War remains the bloodiest conflict in United States history. Historians estimate that between 620,000 and 750,000 soldiers lost their lives, with countless civilians also affected by disease, hunger, and displacement. The war preserved the Union, ended the institution of slavery, strengthened the authority of the federal government, and transformed the nation's political and social landscape. Its battlefields became places of remembrance. Its leaders became enduring figures in history. And its lessons continue to shape conversations about freedom, equality, and national unity. More than 150 years later, the echoes of the Civil War can still be felt, not only in American politics and society, but in the nation's ongoing effort to understand its past. The American Civil War was far more than a conflict between North and South. It was a defining chapter in the story of the United States, a war that tested a nation's ideals, demanded extraordinary sacrifice, and forever changed the course of history.